Today we have with us Jack Detch, a national security reporter for foreign policy. Jack, hi, good to have you here.
Hey, good to be here.
So, do you think Ukraine will be the ultimate kingmaker or king unmaker in these speaker elections? And how is the situation with the support for Ukraine in the Congress? How is it in general?
It'll be one of the king-making issues, right? The thing that dooms Kevin McCarthy, of course, was Ukraine aid, among other things, but also just really this referendum from the far right of the party that had turned on him, and that he really based his speakership on the Matt Gaetzes, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world, who came up with an 11th hour vote to oust him. And of course, McCarthy had not done a great job of cultivating Democrats, so they eventually came along for the ride, basically cheering on the chaos in the Republican Party. Now you sort of have mostly a two-way race that's emerged between Jim Jordan of Ohio, a very pro-Trump person who did not bring Ukraine aid to the floor, focused on the southern border in the United States, and Steve Scalise, who's a little bit more middle of the road, a little bit more average conservative when it comes to military aid to Ukraine. So he could be somebody who might take either a McCarthy-like tack and kind of try and work the aid behind the scenes, or somebody who tries and to ally with some of the more rank and file, middle of the road Republicans, the Michael McCalls of the world on House Foreign Affairs, who have been very, very supportive of Ukraine aid. So it's very much up in the air. It's very much in the balance right now. The administration is already looking at alternatives. Of course, we saw reporting this week. It could be money out of the State Department, but it may be a sign that sort of this really battle rhythm of these aid packages coming from the PDA, right? The presidential stocks that are off of the Pentagon shelves. That might not be in the offing for a little while. Of course, there's $5 billion left in that fund, so that will keep churning for a little while. It gives Ukraine a bit of a lifeline for American aid, but not much.
So can we count that we obviously can count on the Russian caucus, the Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greenes, on stopping any speakership for people who support aid for Ukraine? Can we count on, for instance, the Ukraine caucus, the McCalls, the Representative Bacon, if I'm not mistaken, and others who support aid to Ukraine?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you want to get any semblance of where Don Bacon stands on Ukraine, just look at the flag on his door. It says something about a Ruski Vойны Kорабль. I mean, this is going to be, sort of an animating debate within the Republican Party, especially as the election season heats up. And you have to think, too, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party see foreign policy in very different ways. The Democratic Party sees foreign policy as something that takes place overseas. The Republican Party is very much animated by the southern border issue, by immigration. And that's one of the splits that we see in this race between Jim Jordan, the more pro-Trump candidate, somebody who Trump has already come out and endorsed on his Truth Social. He's still off Twitter, versus Steve Scalise. Jordan is somebody who's really basically kind of allied with the Matt Gaetzes and the Marjorie Taylor Greenes in the sense of wants to see border aid before any conversation about Ukraine. Scalise hasn't said anything of the sort. So I think that's going to continue to be an animating tension within the Republican Party. But as the election season heats up, you're going to see a lot more focus on the southern border. Now, it always depends, right? That's the major variable. If Ukraine ekes out a major battlefield victory, if you see the advance go forward towards Tokmak and even further, and you have something that's animating the news cycle, that's pushing Americans back into this, that would be a key variable that could change the situation. But you certainly have seen in the past few months, when you look at the opinion polling, Reuters was out with a poll this week showing American support, at least the public number, for aid to Ukraine, going down from 46 to 41%. Significant softening, at least if we're to believe those poll numbers, in the past few months. And so the Republican Party is going to try to respond to that, it seems.
you mentioned the Biden speech and the report that they are going to find some way around. What are the options for the aid, at least for the closest several months? What are the options apart from that $5 billion in PDA, and is there any backdoor to get this get this assistance to vote in the Congress for Senate, or I don't know, somehow, or what options does the administration have to get the same numbers, or at least the close numbers to what they planned for Ukrainian assistance?
Well, it's the PDA, the off-the-shelf stuff, and the stuff that's already being made and being delivered to Ukraine, the USAI, the U.S. Security Assistance Fund to Ukraine. So there are a lot of things in that package that still are being made and being produced for Ukraine. Of course, we saw the Abrams tanks that just were delivered in the past few weeks. The other thing that would be sort of a major boon for Ukraine would be the ground launched small diameter bomb, which doesn't have quite the range of the ATACMS, but is certainly something that's basically delivered in a canister. It's like, imagine a shipping container lifts up and fires out a big missile. So not the thick missile that everyone wants in Kiev, but not too far off. So that's something that could be a major factor here as well. So you have those two funds. You have the State Department's FMF funding. So one report in Politico, of course, this week was looking at the possibility that the administration is considering going into that FMF fund. That's just basically mainline military aid. So you might not be able to get some of the heavier weapons through that type of funding. But we've seen lots of mainstream small arms, the regular sort of guns and ammo that Ukraine will need. And then also you see allies being more motivated and more mobilized. The Swedish defense minister today just announced a $2.2 billion package. That's more than I think the Americans have contributed in a single package for quite a while. So you do see the allies motivating, and stepping up, and those defense industrial bases, like the Swedish defense industrial base, like the German defense industrial base. Now you see the Germans, of course, almost adopting what the Americans had a while ago, sort of this PDA model where they're doing aid package after aid package. So you do see a steady drumbeat as the U.S. moves a little bit more into election season from other parts. The other thing, too, is the U.S. has, quote unquote, excess defense articles, right? This is similar to the whole PDA thing, but it's out of the State Department. So you can peel other types of things out of American stocks and send them to Ukraine. The major problem with that, right, is not all of that stuff works. And it's the same problem you've had with PDA, where it's you send vehicles, you send armor, you send equipment, and then it gets into Ukrainian hands and they can't use the things.
You sound cautiously optimistic in your assessment. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what it feels like. And I'm just wondering, because we over here, we look at what is happening in Congress and all these things, and the morale is still high in Ukraine, but it's a tad depressing, not knowing your future.
Slightly suicidal, to be honest. Yes.
Yeah, everybody is a teeny tiny bit depressed at this point. But I was just wondering, are you cautiously optimistic, and why are you actually? This I want to know.
I think there's some optimism from folks I've talked to in the Pentagon. Look, one thing that you have to look at is just sort of the dynamics of the battlefield and the strategic tit for tat, right? Because that's very important. The way the Ukrainians see the battlefield and the way that the allies and partners see the battlefield. And of course, the talking points from Washington are always like, we're all aligned on this. Ukraine is leading the fight, but there's always some frustration, right? Like Ukraine has fought a much more artillery focused war than I think a lot of folks in the West would like to see. Some folks in the West are calling out the lack of maneuver. I think there's a degree to which people on the front lines would probably quibble with that. But you do see sort of those strategic tensions between the West and Ukraine. I think one thing that's interesting, right, that we've seen out of American officials, and this was very clear actually when I traveled to the Ukraine contact group with Defense Secretary Austin a couple of weeks ago, was just there was a lot of optimism that Ukraine could extend the fighting season through the winter, more so than we saw last year. There was a lot of optimism that with the new armor, with the new systems that were coming in. They could continue to clear out defenses. And I think we've also seen sort of a change in the battlefield where Ukraine, of course, has begun to break through a lot of those Russian defenses and really penetrate. And you also see, too, I mean, the Russians haven't really learned the lesson from last year of doing these big static headquarters elements. I mean, the Ukraine's still hitting the Black Sea Fleet. Ukraine is still hitting these major large elements. Of course, you want longer range weapons to be able to do it. But there's still kind of this aspect of the battlefield that we've seen from 2022, where the effectiveness of Ukrainian long range fires and the effectiveness of Ukrainian ground warfare is still on display. And I think that's left certainly a taste of optimism in Washington. Now, I think, again, the question going back to it is just, does Ukraine have another big victory in store in the kitty before, we see kind of the muddy season hit, a little bit of pause in the fighting before things kick back up? But I think in the United States, at least, there's going to be some recognition, whether or not you can actually realize it because of all the politics and the political headwinds we've been talking about, that you don't want to see this major pause in the fighting. And that's probably going to drive the administration and congressional Republicans who are on the side of Ukraine to say, hey, this is kind of the time that we really try and stick it to the Russians and change the complexion of the battlefield before we see the election season in the U.S. hit.
I know that foreign policy is not something which is like very important in the American politics, in elections, particularly even in presidential elections. But do you think the question of Ukraine could be something decisive for Biden elections, for instance, for Biden presidency? If he, for instance, brings some kind of a big Ukrainian victory, does it make his chances, gives him more chances to win those small margins? Or if there will be huge Ukrainian losses, that diminishes his chances? What do you think about that?
I think if there were a big Ukrainian win, it could be a boon to Biden. Certainly, we saw that a little bit to a degree with President Obama in 2011, right, when he had the major foreign policy win of wiping Osama bin Laden off the map. That was certainly something that boosted his chances, although the decisive thing was really that the economy didn't go belly up. And I think that's, of course, what Biden's counting on here. So I think that's going to be the real thing to watch in the United States is the jobs numbers, is the economic situation. If it gets worse, it's going to be more difficult for the administration to make the case for aid. They're going to want to pump more money into the economy, although, they may sort of try to do both. What's interesting to me, and this point has been raised to me by folks on the Republican side, actually, folks in the political space, we haven't really seen sort of that connection being made either on the Democratic side or the Republican side between something that we actually talked about on the last episode, right, of the degree to which the U.S. is sort of trying to have this defense industrial revolution in support of Ukraine. It's revitalizing Stinger lines, it's revitalizing production, and we haven't really seen like a member of Congress or a presidential candidate come out and say, this is an economic engine, or I want this in my state to produce more weapons, more ammunition to send to the Ukrainians and also boost jobs. So that's something we haven't seen that could be an effective line for somebody. But we have certainly seen, at least in the Republican caucus, a huge split, right, between the Vivek Ramaswamys, the Ron DeSantises, and of course, looming over all of it, the Donald Trumps of the world, versus the more Reagan-esque Republicans, if you would, who sort of see in Ukraine almost a Poland of the 1980s, a system that's a democratic ally in Eastern Europe that will set the tone for the rest of the NATO alliance and of course the rest of the European Union. Of course, understanding they're not in those blocks yet, but so I think there's a huge political split that we're seeing, and of course it's important to note too on the other end of the political spectrum that we were talking about, the Matt Gaetzes, the Marjorie Taylor Greens, et cetera, they sort of meet up with the AOCs, with the Squad, with people like Bernie Sanders, perhaps, who are a little bit more skeptical of American foreign involvement. So you kind of see this meeting place on both sides of the political spectrum when it comes to issues like Ukraine.
I was going to ask something, coming back to something you said previously about, Ukraine gaining some leverage because of our victories. Why? Because we've spoken about this partially with General Hodges in our previous video, by the way. Watch that video. We're going to leave the link down below. Also subscribe to this channel because we talk about these things a lot, and like this video in particular, please. So, if we talked about that Ukraine needs these victories to kind of sell its case, if you will, juice up the situation. Why isn't the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters strike being represented as such a victory? Because it is, I mean, it's not as obvious as, gaining ground in Kherson or Kharkiv region as we've seen it before. But it is a very interesting case, since everybody was always so scared. I mean, there are people in the West who are afraid of so-called nuclear escalation if Ukraine even dares to look at Crimea. But there you go. Ukraine makes a strike. A whole bunch of important people are dead. And somehow that is not perceived as a kind of, Ukraine victory and Ukraine progress. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, Melania. It's, I think when Americans look at combat through the public lens, it's about troops taking and holding territory. That is the key thing that moves the needle in the American public. And that's certainly the problem that the United States has had in its own wars, right? There hasn't been a lot of swapping and gaining of territory. And when there has, it's been certainly painful and arduous. We saw that in Iraq. We saw that in Afghanistan. I think the other thing that's at play here is when Ukraine does make a significant strike or does gain ground in the United States within the political debate, there's not a lot of articulation about how this fits into American strategy, right? It's just sort of a parallel that's happening on the other end of the world and we're supporting the Ukrainians, but it's not articulated within sort of any context of the American national interest. And, I think that's one thing that came out early in the war. And I believe we had this conversation the last time where Lloyd Austin came out and said, our goal is to degrade the Russian military through the war in Ukraine. And then that talking point basically died. You sort of see that in some parts of Congress. Some members, some aides have basically pushed back on the administration when they've tried to basically make the argument, we can't send ATACMS because we don't have enough ATACMS. And then you look at the war plans and it's like, well, if you move ATACMS from the China plan and the North Korea plan over to Ukraine to help them fight the Russians and basically conduct the American war plan, then you find the ATACMS. But I think, again, the issue is you just don't see this really bookmarked as a part of American strategy. You see this as American support for Ukrainian strategy. There's not a lot of ownership, I guess, over the result.
Do you think Biden's speech, the Biden speech, which he announced just recently, is something they consider as a solution to this problem you just talked about? Maybe should we expect of some announcement of the real American interest in it, the real goal of this American involvement, and the real expectations of Biden administration of the United States of America?
I mean, I think we can expect a lot of the usual talking points, right? That this is a critically important aid that the U.S. is providing. It's helping Ukraine gain ground. It's something that's nominally in the American national interest, but I don't know that we will see that national interest, I guess, wholly articulated in this type of speech. Now that's something that I could be wrong about, but that's sort of the preview that Biden has hinted at that's in the tea leaves. The other thing, of course, that's important to bring up too is the United States hasn't, I guess, decisively put its foot down on what it would like to see in terms of the end game, what it would like to see in terms of Ukrainian military that comes out of this, whether it would like to see Ukrainian territorial integrity, which we know has been Zelensky's position since 2019 and presumably before that. So, I think this is just going to be sort of something that the administration is trying to basically juice more political momentum, put more political energy into it. I think one other thing that we could see is sort of Biden using his rhetoric about defending democracies that we saw in Arizona the other week. So we will definitely see this connected to the Biden strategy. Whether we see this connected to a broader U.S. foreign policy strategy, I think, is another question.
I can't believe I'm doing this, but I'm about to address President Biden a second time on this channel. Mr. President, if you're watching this, please don't forget to like and subscribe and listen to what we have to say. Maybe you can, put more of American interest in your speeches to kind of, own the whole thing and make sure that, American nation feels complicit in our Ukrainian victories. We're happy to share them with the great country that the United States is. Guys, I thank you for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Please, again, I'm always asking you, even if you're not President Biden, please subscribe to this channel. Please leave a comment about what you've heard today. Maybe you have some thoughts. We'll gladly read them. We read all the comments all the time. And we will see you guys next week.